This notion that children should be seen and not heard, that was just our way of life. We didn't have no rights till we left our parents' homes.
How do you reflect on how your father fathered you during that time?
Seeing the world through their eyes made me appreciate what my responsibility was, especially since one of them was a single parent.
We need more stories like that, where we focus on how we lead, how we do the right thing in the face of true physical violence.
The threat of deadly consequences for asserting oneself, demanding respect, that was just deadly stuff.
How do you stay strong as a young man who's just trying to find his way?
Well, that's an easy one.
Go on.
Welcome to Dad Pod. I'm Mike.
And I'm Luke. We're friends here in Madison, and we both have kids. And at least for us, becoming a dad has been transformational. We talk to all sorts of dads in all sorts of situations to learn from their unique challenges, lessons, and evolutions. The goal is simple: learn from each other to become better dads.
If you dig it, please find us on Apple or Spotify and click follow. That single click helps put us in front of more dads, which Luke would really appreciate.
Jeffrey, welcome to the podcast today. So happy to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to participate in this conversation, but I deny the word balance. That's right. That is, I would substitute with efforts to balance.
Attempts, desires,
right?
Striving to balance.
Yeah. It makes me think of that section in the bookstore that's for humor books, and my buddy always says, no, that should be called the attempted humor section. And so I feel like we should call it attempted balance in this regard.
Got it. Well, I think that's a universal theme that we tend to run up against in this conversation, in this podcast. Maybe to get started, we often like to start by looking back, and where we could begin is to have you describe your childhood, being born in the 1960s in the Mississippi Delta.
Yeah, well, I was actually born in the town of Biloxi at an Air Force Base hospital, which is on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. My father was in the Air Force and was also a pastor of a tiny Baptist church in the little hamlet of Wiggins, Mississippi, population 1,590 people. And in that little town, their church, Bethlehem Baptist Church, was one of the many churches in 1963 that were engaged in registering Black people to vote. And what strikes me that I learned only in the last couple of years from historians is that the civil rights movement was a compromise. It was a compromise from human rights. That, after the backlash from the Reconstruction era, it was determined that the most we could hope for was civil rights, and among them voting rights. And the year that I was born, 60 Black churches in Mississippi were bombed for the work that they were doing, trying to register Black people to vote. So that's the context into which I was born. My father was among the civil rights workers at the rally that was led by Medgar Evers. And on the way home to Wiggins from the rally, my father heard on the news that Medgar Evers had been gunned down in the driveway of their home. And what is further striking to me that I also learned recently, just a few months ago, I was on a panel with one of Medgar and Merle Evers' kids, who, when she heard where my parents were doing this work, she said, "We don't stop at Wiggins. If we go from Jackson to the Gulf Coast, we
Wow.
increase our speed as we go through that town."
Wow.
So it's really a striking thing to have been born in Mississippi and in that context. And that's where I graduated kindergarten. And I have here in this room where I'm sitting my kindergarten diploma from Green Street Kindergarten in Jackson, Mississippi, which I have framed and matted with a nice velvet mat.
Yeah.
I don't have any other diplomas on the walls of my home or office, but I keep that one to remind me of where I've come from.
So if that's the context, and I mean, I think it's so critical that you provide that. What was the experience? If you're to go back and think about the core experiences and stories you carry from that part of your childhood, what was it like growing up in that context?
Well, it didn't strike me as unusual because it was all I knew. The threat um, of deadly consequences for asserting oneself, demanding respect. Um, that was just deadly stuff, and we knew both explicitly from watching our parents and other Black people interact in that society in that time. Uh, and because of explicit conversations, now referred to as the talk, about how to comport oneself when dealing with the wider or whiter society at large.
Right.
And so I don't remember anything in particular, although I finished my last 2 years of high school in Huntsville, Alabama. And that year, in April, a few weeks before graduation, a young Black man in Mobile, Alabama, whose name is Michael, I forget his last name, he was walking a fellow student home from school who was white and female, and her cousins hung him in front of his parents' house.
Oh,
I was 17. It was weeks before my 18th birthday, and when I finished high school a few weeks later, I got the hell out of the South.
Yeah.
And I came up to Boston um, to go to college. But these days, of course, I have returned to the South, both to Mississippi, where I was born, to pass this baton forward of voting rights, working with young rural Blacks. And then in Charleston, South Carolina, there's a modest two-family home in the workers section of Charleston that my mother's grandparents bought in 1918, and that property is still in the family. And unlike then, it is now one of those re-gentrified communities where what I call the bugaboo index is very high. And y'all know what I mean by the bugaboo
Yes.
index is when you see, a bunch of white women walking through what was a Black poor neighborhood in these, multi-thousand-dollar strollers as parents. But it's the neighborhood a few less than a mile from where the during the Obama administration,
Right.
young man went in and killed Black people
Right.
during a prayer meeting, and it's also within a mile of the setting of the Black neighborhood for the Porgy and Bess opera.
Right.
So So I still go back, but
Right.
things are a
Still
little
very
bit
alive.
different now.
How do you reflect on how your father fathered you during that time?
I think the way I would answer that question is um, that I have come to realize that my father was a person beyond being my father, and that he had challenges that he faced um, uh, in order to be a parent, but in order to be considered as a human at all, worthy of any dignity or respect. Um, and that's been really really enlightening in the past few years as I've encountered my own child who did not grow up in a context where children are meant to be seen and not heard, and
Right.
who, asserts herself and her interests and her ideas and her dignity, which is a striking thing for me, having grown up in a completely different context for my own humanity and
Right.
for the humanity of my child who I'm trying to parent.
One of the things you mentioned that I would love if you're willing to share is you mentioned you had the talk. What was the content of that talk? What was it
It is
specifically that your parents communicated to you?
well. The talk is really not a single conversation.
Hmm.
Rather, it's an ongoing series of reflections about how an incident unfolds. So, and it's sometimes unspoken but modeled, so that when our family would, in the station wagon, be driving to Charleston, South Carolina, um, and stop, on a state road at a filling station, as they were called then, and we're spending a lot of money to fill the tank, and my mother says, my babies need to use the bathroom. And the gas station attendant says, we ain't got no bathroom. And my mom says, well, where the hell do you piss? Um, and that was striking to me in a lot of ways because my mother was a teacher
Mm.
and she was raised by very conservative parents. And I rarely ever heard her swear. And I rarely ever saw her anger and raise her voice. And the tension in that moment that I remember was incredible.
Mm.
And and my father, this minister, this pacifist, had a revolver under the seat next to
Mm.
the 8-track player. So how I saw both my parents respond, uh, the way that they, other than that comment, that question from my mother, they were able to maintain their composure and to keep us safe by restraining themselves again beyond that moment, which was dismissed, that question of hers, by the gas station attendant. Um, and we often had conversations about incidences like that. Um, I can remember going into a store and wanting to try on hats and being asked not to try on hats while we saw white customers trying on hats. Um, so it wasn't one talk, but rather a series of lessons, both modeled and articulated, about how to stay alive.
How, as a young man, or a boy trying to become a man, trying to find his way, do you maintain how did you defend against these external, like, how did you keep your sense of self-worth, defend mentally against these pressures coming at you from probably every direction to say that you are in some way lesser? Like how does that mentally how do you stay strong as a young man who's just trying to find his way?
Well, funny you should ask, Mike, because my twice a week therapy session is all about right now, still at 61, is all about trying to identify, to excavate all of the sources that told me, in the words of a Black Harlem Renaissance writer, you ain't shit and you ain't never gonna be shit. Right? So I think one of the ways that I was able to imagine that there might be some other possibility was when I would see Black people in popular culture. So seeing Dr. Uhuru on Star Trek in the 60s, that was kind of amazing. There were only maybe 5 TV shows in the 60s and 70s that featured strong Black characters. There was Julia, a show about a Black nurse. There was Bill Cosby in Better Days and I Spy. There was Julian Dixon in Hogan's Heroes. One or two others, but the fact that I can name them, right, is evidence of just how rare it was. And I also saw that my parents' response to racial oppression was to act, right? To register, even in the face of existential threats, to register Black voters in rural Mississippi. My father and some of his buddies, they realizing that there were unmet financial services needs, they banded together with Black sports figure, and with a Black entertainment figure, a couple Black entertainment figures, and with a white ally. And they formed a Black bank in 1972. They found the resources to convert an abandoned major supermarket that was across the street from public housing. They found the resources to convert that abandoned supermarket into a Head Start, early childhood education and nutrition program for something like 200 kids. So while I didn't imagine myself, these were not things that built wealth or were, soaring achievements in the way one traditionally thinks about it. They were a response to oppression and a way to assert one's aspirations in some way that was, collective and that rather than individual. So those were a couple of things that I saw modeled. But the broader world, it was not possible for me to imagine the kind of achievements that even many of my classmates have achieved, right, as people of color in this society. Wasn't possible for me to imagine then, and that I'm sure is due to an array of different factors about me individually, and the places where I lived and the things that I saw.
How do you then carry forward your experience to informing the fathering and education than of your daughter. You know, time has moved forward. You're, you know, kind of living in different places, but you've had, you know, you want to, I think every father is probably programmed to want to make it in some way better for their next generation. And to go through that type of challenge and then have the next generation that you're guiding, you know, how do you carry that forward?
For me, it's a question of not carrying it forward, the elements that constrained my imagination. Which, you know, when I was 45, I became a parent. It was 2008. If we had lived in the town of Newton instead of in Cambridge, my black child in 2008 would have had a black mayor, Seti Warren, a black governor, Deval Patrick, and the Obamas in the White House. So with her first 8 years of seeing the Obamas in the White House and seeing so many iconic figures soar and achieve across the array of human pursuits, people of color and women, the challenge for me is to not impose my own limits of imagination on my child. And then the challenge is how to support her brilliance and light being asserted by herself without my, you know, putting the brakes or introducing doubt or questions. And to ensure that whatever self-worth she has isn't in any way constrained by my imagination.
First of all, I have to just say that listening to the story of your parents is inspirational in a way that I think we need more stories like that, where we focus on how we lead, how we build community, how we do the right thing in the face of like true physical violence. It is deeply inspirational.
Yeah, thank you. It really, you know, they were just ordinary black people trying to respond, you know, with what they could, and the resource for them was the black church. It was every Sunday morning, you know, being there and gathering with other folks with whom they shared, you know, cultural affinity, and
Right.
and before the church got started, you know, there were a few around up front who were praying and singing,
Right.
and they would sing, you know, nobody knows the trouble I'm seeing. But then they would also sing, "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine." So it was just what I knew and what I saw and what I witnessed. And while I didn't think of it as inspiring at the time, there's no question but that it informs
Right.
what I do and attempt to do and what I've tried to do in my life.
Yeah, it's so clear that you've chosen consciously and probably in ways subconsciously to continue that legacy when you look at your life's work. The question that I was interested in is, you talk about one of your fathering goals is basically how to prevent this passing on or how to break this chain. Could you give us an example or tell us a story to help us tangibly understand what that is like through an interaction with your daughter where you found yourself imposing limits that you didn't necessarily want to?
Oh, sure. There are numerous, right?
I'm sure there are. Yeah.
So, when my child was 13, she's now 16. she would articulate her frustration with the expectation that I would hear it and respond to the request in some way that was affirmative, right? Now, it would sound like, Poppy, you're a expletive, expletive, expletive. I don't need you to tell me what to do. I need you to listen, right? Now, when I was 13, if I even dreamed of addressing either of my parents in that way, I would apologize when I woke up, right? My 5'2" mother, there was no way that I would even, no, not at all. So this notion that children should be seen and not heard, that was just our way of life. We didn't have no rights till we left our parents' homes. My child has the expectation that she, as a child, has a right to if not inform the decisions that her mom and I make about her life, but that she gets a vote. That's an astounding thing. And for me, that idea has been is probably the most challenging example of trying to constrain myself physically, right? Because my reflex that was modeled is, feeling a shoe fly by my head when I was a child and said something in the wrong tone, let alone the wrong words, or being beaten for a transgression with a switch that of my own choosing, or one that that my parents choose, that was well utilized on one of the 5 children in our household. So to not respond, let alone trying to sort out with the family therapist and with my kids' therapist and with my own therapist, how do I discipline this child so that I don't break her spirit? So yeah, there are a number of examples, but that kind of confrontation has been part of the effort, the ongoing effort to try to be the break in that cycle of trauma, of intergenerational trauma that came from Black bodies being beaten into submission for resistance or for trying to exert their interests. And there's, in order for the society to have built its wealth over the last 500 years, that was a critical component. So it's in our DNA, in all of us. It just, gets focused on in those moments. For me, that's what I, am aware of and keep in mind as I try to, be the best parent that I can.
What do you do to explore those, to come to those conclusions? So you mentioned therapy in different forms. Where do you go for answers, for consult, for guidance yourself in these questions?
Well, so a lot of places. One of the places is fellow parents, some of whom grew up like I did, and I call them and say, "You won't believe what the fuck I just experienced," right? And they're like, "No, bro, no, you can't be serious." And then there are other parents, and my kids, her friends' parents are, in their late 40s, mid to late 40s. So, and many of them grew up here in Cambridge. So they help me to interpret sort of how to how to parent these days, and so that's really an interesting source. Um, but also, I think over the years it's been literature. So the writings of James Baldwin, for instance, whose centennial birthday was earlier this month, August 2nd, and how he was able to assert and share his gifts with the world, that didn't want him. That's a model that I look to. I think of the plays of August Wilson, right, who wrote a play set in each decade of the last century, and especially Fences, right, which I was privileged to see on Broadway with James Earl Jones at the height of his career.
Oh wow.
And there was a moment where, he is a sanitation worker, and he is a person who had a dream of being a professional ball player, and his son now wants to pursue that dream, and he's trying to protect his son from the disappointment, and is really not in favor, is not supporting this dream, and there was a striking conversation exchange between the two of them, where the son says that he wants his dad to love him. And he says, love you? I'm trying to do right by you. So those are some of the sources that inform my aspiration, and my imagination about how what possibilities might be different, for my child than were possible for me uh, when I was 15 or 16 in the early 70s.
What are some of the major questions or considerations in front of you right now with a child of that age?
So this idea about what she can imagine. The other thing that's different is what she has access to. So I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, I was volunteering on an attorney general campaign here in Massachusetts, by a basketball former professional basketball player named Maura Healey, and my kid, knew that Maura Healey was a woman, and that no woman had been elected attorney. Rarely had a woman been elected attorney general, and she wanted to campaign. And she wanted me to take her out of school to campaign on election day. I was like, no, we can't do that. So she convinced me to let her, during her lunch hour, at least hold signs near the polling station that was at the back of her school. So we did that. Maura Healey becomes Attorney General. My kid continues to campaign for her reelection. She speaks at a fundraiser, for her 10th birthday. She speaks at a fundraiser for Maura Healey. And then when she's 13, she wants to get Maura Healey's help because she's interested in transit. So she gets a 15-minute appointment with the Attorney General. And this is Zoom appointment, right? So I'm there, and she acknowledges me, says hello, and then they have this conversation for 15 minutes, during which my kid says, "I want you to help get me connected to the transit people," and she was like, "Why don't you come work for me?" And my kid's eyes light up, and she says, the attorney general says, "We've never had a middle school intern before, but we're lawyers. We can figure that out." Right? So she does this, month-long internship with the attorney general or whatever it was, a couple of weeks. And then a couple of years later, Maura Healey becomes governor. Right? So now my kid is like doing, advancing events for the governor. And when she emails the governor, the governor emails her back. Now, there is no way in hell that my parents could have imagined a governor emailing them, talking to them, in any way in Mississippi when I was a kid, right? Segregation then, segregation now, segregation forever, said the Alabama governor, right? So things are different for her, uh, in terms of what she can imagine for herself. Because as I said, she grew up the first 8 years of her life with the Obamas in the White House, and she saw a lot of elected. The work that I was doing that brought us here was to support um, uh, women of color who were interested in policy making positions as elected officials or appointed officials. So there was a young black woman who came to my office to talk about her candidacy for city council. Well, now that woman is Ayanna Pressley, congresswoman from Massachusetts. And again, my kid was holding signs, for that candidate. And then we were fortunate enough to, in 2019, to go to Washington, D.C. We happened to be there visiting families, and she got invited to go to the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives and use their electronic, voting device to vote for a black member of Congress on the floor of the U.S. House, you know? And then outside, we ran into to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the hallway. Um, yeah, this is not this is not the
Yeah.
experience that I had or that I could imagine. When I tried to get an internship, I kept calling and writing and calling and writing, and they finally gave me an internship for the month of August. Well, you know what the month of August is. It's recess, so I did nothing but stuff envelopes. I only saw my congressman once, and that was to take a picture. And in the picture, if I were to hold it up to you, you'd see him looking off into the distance, right? So what she can imagine is informed by her experience and the circumstances for her that are unimaginable to my parents, um, uh, both of whom
Yeah.
are gone now, but very different.
And it's not just what she can imagine at this point, it's what she's literally done.
Right.
It's these literal experiences that are unimaginable to, having zoomed back to the 1960s. That the other question I wanted to bring us to was this question of, so this is your experience, and we've talked a lot about your experience in your context. What's it like co-parenting your daughter with somebody who comes from such a different cultural background and cultural context?
You're not suggesting that my white Jewish wife, former wife, born in 1974, comes from such a different context. So, for instance, we both are concerned about our child safety. Even here in Cambridge, where where President Obama said that the police had acted stupidly when they arrested Henry Louis Gates, right? Um, so we both are concerned as parents of black kids are concerned about the safety of their child. Um, what we have different as parents, as co-parents, is our experience moving in society. So when I go out the door of my apartment here in Cambridge, in Inman Square, a neighborhood that, like much of Cambridge, used to be diverse when I lived here in the '90s when Bill Clinton was elected. Um, but now, with rent control being eliminated, uh, all of Cambridge has become um, so white and so affluent, and less diverse. So unlike in the '90s when I lived in the same neighborhood a few blocks away, I would see black people all the time when I went outside my house, day, night, weekends. Now I see black people during the day sometimes, but not on nights and weekends. And in fact, when I'm sitting on my patio, 15 or 20 feet from the sidewalk, and white people walk by, sometimes they are startled to see me. Or when I have the side door of my Honda Odyssey, minivan open, and I'm going in the house unloading stuff, they're visually startled by this large black man. So that's an experience that I have and expect to have every day. Of course, they're called microaggressions, but they don't feel very micro to me when they happen sometimes. But the cumulative effect of that, because folks come from around the country to study and be engaged in biomedical research here in Cambridge, and they come to this neighborhood and other neighborhoods in Cambridge because they're safe, because they feel safe. They don't, and then they encounter me, and their bodies react. If you talk to them, they are not racist. But again, as I said, 500 years of being in our DNA, what this arrangement is supposed to be like. And my black body is supposed to behave in certain ways and be restricted to certain places. My co-parent and I don't have that in common.
How does that end up reflecting in how you have to then interact with your daughter? Like how does that, I mean, again, you've made it very tangible what it is like. How does that reflect in how you are a father to and a co-parent with the rest of your family?
Well, so my father-in-law, with whom I maintain a very close relationship, we celebrate one another's birthdays together with our one-on-one dinners. And and before COVID, 8 years ago, when we told her parents of our divorce, my father-in-law took me to coffee, and I was like, "Oh shit, what is he going to say?" And he said, "We've got to find a way to stay in one another's lives." And so we started meeting for scotch, and we did that, scotch or lunch, or sometimes I would have scotch at lunch. Uh, right, as we talk about
As
all
one
these,
does.
right? Well, as we talk about all these challenges of parenting and stuff, he was on the school committee and desegregated when Cambridge desegregated its schools. And he was one of the leaders of that, and he's also a playwright. And so one of the things that happened was about 5 or 6 years ago, uh, my kid, who of course spends a lot of time with her grandfather, began writing a play about an encounter at CVS that a black man has and gets arrested for asserting their rights. So this was this was part Henry Louis Gates' story, but seen through the eyes of my kid who heard me
Right.
talk about the experience of being a large black man in a red coat in winter standing at CVS at the prescription counter waiting to be served and having a white person come up behind me and the pharmacist look up and say, "Can I help you?" And the white customer saying he was here first. I'm like, how do you overlook a 200-pound black man in a red coat with a hood, you know? So my kid sees that, and starts to work it out with her, with her grandfather. So having the involvement of both my father-in-law and my co-parent, her mom, that's one of the ways in which it's unfolded, despite our obvious, cultural and racial differences. Well, sleep was the first thing, right? I remember being in a fog. The other thing that changed for me was, I had waited until I was 45 to become a parent, and I wanted to be around for it. And so I took a job, a requirement of which was that I would have Fridays off, Friday afternoons, beginning at noon off. And so my parenting became a priority in that way. But that was the most immediate changes that I spent Friday afternoons, and I would take my kid to school, drop her off, and pick her up, and that was how my day was arranged. So I didn't work, I didn't stay at the office extra hours. I was home, by 5:30 or 6, and we were engaged in play.
Was that goal, or was that unique in that you were really prioritizing over work being a father?
Yeah, that was unusual, but again, I had waited till I was 45 to start parenting, and a lot of my friends my age had started parenting in their 20s. And then I also saw my father. My parents divorced when I was in college, and my father had two more kids with another woman, and by that time he was in his 60s, and he spent more time with that new set of kids than he did in the 70s when he was, saving the world more broadly than accompanying his new kids in life. So I was informed by that, and yeah, it was pretty unique for a father, but not for the mothers who I knew, who always had the expectation that they would not balance, but do the Herculean tasks of homemaker, parent, career person, which always I have five sisters, and yeah, seeing the world through their eyes, made me appreciate what my responsibility was, especially since one of them was a single parent, and it just it made me want to show up, and not just show up, but be present.
What do you see as the major differences between your experience as a black father versus a father who is not black in America?
Really hard to imagine having been black all my life.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean that quite seriously, because I think the major difference is one of imagination of what's possible. There's been a lot of research and books on mediocrity, and the way white mediocrity and white male mediocrity in particular. And when I was doing this job 15 years ago of supporting women of color, who wanted to be elected and appointed policymakers, there was an organization called Emerge, which specifically was set up to support such women and develop, which was one of the grantees of this philanthropy that I worked for. And what Emerge said was, if you are a 27-year-old associate, white male at a law firm in Boston, and you're making a ridiculous amount of money for your age, and you're living in the North End, a very affluent area of Boston. You wake up in the morning, you yawn, and you say, "Oh, the world needs me," right? But if you're a woman, and particularly a woman of color, and they decide to run for office, and their law firm holds fundraisers for them, and they give them time off from their requirement for billing. And by contrast, if you're a Latina who works in East Boston for one of the airline catering companies, and you're concerned about the environment and you want to go beyond showing up for public comment period, and you want to become an elected school board member so you can address it, or a city council member, you have to not only be excellent and amazing and persistent and determined, but you also have to be asked 8 times, the research showed by Emerge, which is now a national organization supporting women. You have to be asked 8 times before you will even consider running for office. And then when you do, you have to find somebody to look after your kids, and you have to find some source of income to replace your hourly paid airline catering job, and then you have to find people in your community who have the resources to fund your campaign. So while it's hard for me to imagine what it is for a white guy to parent, I have that professional experience of hearing those stories from as part of a participatory action research project where we had 6 women of color, collect their thoughts through journaling, through making video recordings, as part of a research study at a school of public policy. So that's that's my source for some of this information and perspective. But I have friends, dear, very close friends who are white. I'm not saying some of my best friends are white, because I hear that said about Black people, but right? I mean, it is true. And the things that they're able to imagine, and the things that they're able to experience because of their unearned advantages of intergenerational wealth, of access. So yeah, those things are hard for me to relate to. Like if my kid wanted to do an internship in Washington, a lot of the interns that I encountered, their parents just paid for them to do an internship, but I had to go door to door and raise, $1,800 to support myself for my month-long internship in August during recess when nothing was happening. So I don't really, yeah. The other way I would describe it recently is that there's a very affluent town here called Andover, and they were having a health disparities forum. They called them Courageous Conversations. And I wasn't invited to be on the panel, but I was invited to be part of the Q&A. And I said to the coordinator, I will agree to be part of the Q&A if I get to ask the first question.
Mm.
And she said, what's that? And I said, I want to know what it's like to opt in, to show up for a courageous conversation about racial oppression, and then opt out and leave. What's that like?
Mm.
To just,
Yeah.
show up when you want to. And if you don't like the way the conversation is going, you leave it. And you don't have to have the experience of your nervous system being challenged, of your existence being challenged. Um, so, so it's the source of rage, really, to think about how differently it must be for me to exist in the world, and especially when it comes to providing opportunities for my kid as a parent. Yes, she is finding her own way, and part of that is because she can imagine things that I can't. All kinds of possibilities. So, whew, yeah.
How do you think about how you divide your attention and energy between this different work that you do and have done, and on the broader society, on the broader world, and then the attention and energy toward your daughter, who's one person, because you're obviously very engaged in this different work that you've done, and I'm curious how you think about those balance, for the lack of a better term, balancing those roles that you hold in your life.
Well, since COVID, right? During COVID, she stayed with me for 3 months, and our apartment is L-shaped, and we can see each other through the windows here, and so she's there schooling remotely, and I'm here working remotely, and that meant that I could not give my work my undivided attention ever for 3 months, right? So that was hard, because I needed to work, and both of my projects, then were in early startup stages, and it was just really rough going, and discouraging and demoralizing, to try to make a go of it on both of those fronts. But I think that having her around and being around her made me, I can't quite articulate it, but it reminds me of, I was a big fan of Alice Walker when I was in college, and in the years after that, I would read everything that came out. And in one of her books, at the beginning, she said that she writes because of and not in spite of her daughter Rebecca. And so I've as a parent remembered that, and the interactions that we have when she comes into my workspace, which is also our living room. And she's sitting there, laying there on the couch with her device, and starts laughing, and then wants to share what she's laughing at with me when I'm trying to meet a deadline for a contract, or a deadline for a grant proposal. I get frustrated, and at the same time, I think about, because of and not in spite of, because I have the luxury of the work that I'm doing, the aim of it is in both the public health intervention that I've created, and in the voter registration work that I do with young people in Mississippi. The aim of both of them is to address exactly the kind of disparities that impact her life to much less of an extent than it did mine, but still remain a threat to her future. And if we get it right, it will contribute to an environment where everyone has a better chance, including her, and that there's less tension and less rage in the bodies of people of color, and then more healing, and ultimately more participation, both as voters and as candidates and policymakers, and people having the tools to address their health with with yoga, which isn't accessible to all right now.
Yeah. That's a profound perspective. And I think that phrase of because of versus in spite of is one that I know I'm going to think about and remember. Where we like to end is, if you were to have one piece of advice to somebody who is becoming a father or somebody who is a new father, what would that piece of advice be?
Oh, that's an easy one. There.
Go on.
So when I was a kid, one of my father's favorite books was called The Prophet by Khalil Gibran.
Love that book.
And you will remember that there's he addresses various issues with these brief chapters. And when I was a kid, my very favorite chapter was the one on children, where it says, your children are not your children, their life's longing for itself. And you are the bow and the arrow that issues forth, and you can't live in their worlds, not even in your imagination. All that kind of stuff. I loved that shit when I was a kid, and as a parent, I love it differently. And so when I read that, which I do frequently, 6 or 8 times a year, I will go back to it.
Wow.
Because what it nurtures me and nourishes me and encourages me to do is to think of myself as accompanying a human in training, a grown up in training, and that my job is to witness, as she has taught me to do. Poppy, I don't need you to give me advice. I need you to listen, right? To witness and to accompany her as she, seeks to assert herself and share her gifts in life. And so that would be my one piece of advice: to read that section of the prophet on children, and see how it might inform how you think as a parent about accompanying your child.
Wow. Jeffrey, I want to thank you deeply for coming on our podcast, sharing your story, covering some ground that we haven't covered before. But I think doing it in a way where I really want us to continue to go deeper and continue to explore. Your story of fatherhood is inspiring in many, many ways. So I just want to say thank you.
My pleasure. Let's circle back in 20 years and see how things are going.
Those dang feedback loops. They're pretty long.
The jury's still out on how I'm doing, but we'll know in 20 years, right? We'll know if my kid's talking to me or just about me in therapy, right?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Before you bounce, I have a quick favor. Please subscribe to the pod. Not only does Luke love juicing those numbers, but it really does help put this thing in front of more dads.
And Mike, on the other hand, just loves juicing. We also now run a listener community on WhatsApp. To join, visit dadpod.fm, and you'll see the delicious link at the top of the homepage.
Come on in, baby. We'd love to have you.